Robert Engleman. You're with World Watch Institute. Historically, World Watch has been on the leading edge of perhaps delivering alarming information. And I think finally a lot of the rest of us have caught up to what World Watch has been saying and being aware of for many years. When you spoke, do you find that's true, that people are catching up to what World Watch has known so long, that awareness is gradually dawning on the rest of us?
It's actually had a big impact on World Watch because we were pioneers, I think, when we started in raising awareness. And alarm seems like a strong word, but it probably is an accurate one. We were raising kind of an alarm. Well, it's before my time. Lester Brown, who founded the organization, was raising an alarm about the state of the environment and the fact that we really were approaching what he called the 29th day, the day that all the lilies have expanded and there's only one day left before they fill the whole pond. He was using that metaphor and trying to get the world to be aware of what exponential growth was doing. Now, paradoxically, it's actually more challenging for us because there are many, many more outlets for that information. There's bloggers, there's online sources of news, there's environmental news, there's plenty of environmental news. So yes, I would say, if anything, I think the fundamental message is more out there than it's been, although it still needs details and to be filled out, and there's continually new information that is in fact alarming. But what is needed now, and what I think World Watch is now ourselves trying to do, is actually be constructive, to try to say what are the main systems we can work on to try to actually bring sustainability on. Let's not just sort of wave our hands and say unsustainability is coming, it's here. How do we address it? So is government important? Is business important? Do we need to think in new ways? The point that I was making in my talk about a lot of this has to do with learning how to actually, can we get along as we grapple with these issues that are really going to be very, very difficult and aren't going to be solved easily.
And one of the things that being so ahead of the curve, I think, has brought World Watch is that real depth and awareness of the nuance of the different and interconnected issues, as you were talking with the students about. You mentioned population, which is a very sensitive issue to take on when our footprint in the West is equivalent to, I don't know how many people now, like 80 people in a developing world who might tend to have more kids. What are some of the ways you've seen that working? You talked about access for women. What are some of the things you've seen are being found to be successful within multi-country contexts
it's a really
around
good question.
population?
Population is a really interesting issue because actually the people who talk about population aren't necessarily the people who are actually doing productive things in relationship to it. So there's this divide, and I come out of this world. Before I joined the World Watch Institute, I worked for an organization called Population Action International.
Oh, I didn't know.
And its function was to promote international partnerships around reproductive health and international family planning. But ironically, in spite of its name, as time went on, it talked about population less and less, and it talked more and more about women's well-being. What's good for women? What do women need to actualize themselves, to have autonomy, to contribute to society? And among the many things that they need, in addition to education and better laws, they can inherit property, they can divorce their husbands, whatever, is that they actually need access to family planning, to birth control, because otherwise they're kind of at the mercy of fate, and they're going to be having unintended pregnancies way too young, which is a big issue for women around the world, particularly in the developing world. So there's this whole movement of people that have actually advanced family planning and access to contraception incredibly over the last few decades. And a lot of them started by reading Paul Ehrlich and The Population Bomb and worrying about the growth of population. But they quickly realized that they didn't need that frame to work with women and work with countries to make sure that that kind of healthcare was available.
So there are all these different religions and perspectives, cultural norms that people come from. What are some of the things that have helped women to have that kind of access or rights or awareness? Where have been some of the places, maybe as a way to ask, that have successfully made that leap and made that kind of a difference that works for the different parts of the population within the culture there?
It's a really good question. I think where it tends to work best is where women themselves realize it's wrong for them to be second-class citizens, and that's an awareness that is really spreading around the world.
It's a hard awareness to come to.
Yeah, right,
It's
right.
surprisingly hard
And there are
to see it.
cultural and religious obstacles to that, clearly, from many different religions. I could certainly name a few, but it's really quite a few, and many different cultures. And when women's awareness about the importance of their own need for equity and equality with men rises and is high, and it coincides with governments' understanding of their own interests in empowering women, powerful things can happen. And an unusual example that surprises many people is actually one close to your experience. It's Iran. What's happened in Iran, although it's, yes, as you mentioned before the camera started going, is that at some point the government of Iran realized that it needed to worry about how many young people it had and whether there'd be opportunities for them, and it kind of went backwards. It reversed a policy of Iranian women should have as many children as possible, and said we really need to encourage contraception and family planning.
For the quality of life for the society
Yeah.
as a whole, so that unemployment, for example, didn't get out of balance, or
Right.
generational numbers.
And this happened to coincide with a time that, for other reasons, I'm not familiar enough with the cultural history of Iran, women were pouring into universities. They were getting educated. They realized they may still have to wear a head covering, but that they had the potential to really change that society. So, and that's a case where fertility fell from like 5 or 6 children to like 2 or fewer than we even have in the
All
United
of a
States.
sudden coinciding with education.
Yeah, with
And those-
education and the
those
government
walk
commitment.
side by side, don't they?
Yes, yeah. And that's one point that I make, that I think where governments have a concern about population, but not a coercive one, as happened, unfortunately, say, in China in the 1980s, where they said, they were a communist country, they said, we just have to have, everybody's got to have one child. That's not the way to go about doing it. You don't need to do that, because when you actually elevate the status of women, help women to achieve what they want to achieve, and you say, by the way, if you want to be sexual but intentional about being a parent, here's help and access to contraception and reproductive health. That's happening all over the world, actually, and to me it's one of the most positive things about our environmental predicament, because whether it's in rich countries where we use more resources, or in poor countries where development is going to happen, we want development to happen, we want them to be using, in effect, more resources, but in a sustainable way. It's good if population growth slows. It's a plus for everybody. It's not the only answer, but it's a plus.
It corresponds to rising income. Is it that when people have access to economic opportunities, they tend to have or need fewer children as maybe their kind of livelihood shifts? Or is it also that having fewer, which comes first? Does having fewer children affect the economic state of a family or household, for example?
Right. It's a co-evolution. You've got it, I think, exactly right.
Because in a farm setting, people, or in some kinds of contexts, people depend on their kids in a way, or they're in the habit of having so
Although
many,
that,
or-
certainly they're in the habit.
And I know
No,
not
you've
much about
got
population.
you've got some instincts that are right. It's a very dynamic situation now. In a lot of rural societies, there certainly is a predisposition to think we need lots of kids to work the farm and to take care of it. So what's happening in farms around the world, if you look at Africa or the Middle East, is young people are leaving farms and they're moving to the cities. So parents don't have a guarantee their children are going to stay behind. The real connection between income and family size is more related to the capacity to buy health care. I mean, there have been interesting studies that
So if
show
people
that
have access to health care, including
they-
access to contraception,
right, they tend to
whatever
have
their
fewer
religion,
children, whatever
they'll
their religion,
choose
or
fewer
even or
children.
whatever exactly.
And is that related also to education levels of women?
It certainly helps.
And the status
It
of
certainly
women
helps.
and
Women who are
governments.
educated are much more capable of resisting cultural norms, for example, if they see that it might improve their lives to go against what they're sort of expected to do.
And where does that leave men? I mean, in these cultures that have made this kind
Well,
of transition.
some men get frustrated, and some men say, like, this is actually really a good thing. I don't have to work so hard. I don't have to support as many children. And there's a good chance my wife will survive childbirth, which is a real concern.
Which is
when you
still
have multiple.
perilous. We forget that
Absolutely,
in the West.
very perilous. And that's one reason why I think women, I wrote a whole book about how women historically have had an interest in managing their childbearing, if for no other reason, because they know the risks to themselves and to their children of having lots of kids. So I think men are actually, I tend to think of men as like being a little behind women, but they're catching on.
In understanding
In understanding the
dimensions.
importance of these connections and understanding the benefits to their own lives and to their communities by having fewer children. But this is happening all over the place, and the only places it's really not happening, sadly, is where religions actively block it. It's happened in the Philippines. It's actually beginning to reverse a little bit in Iran, unfortunately. But in certain countries, religions and governments say, no, we don't really want to provide this access. I think that's actually part of the story in Central America, where fertility rates have remained quite high, in part because the Catholic Church is very strong with the governments of, say, Honduras and Guatemala particularly, and has not encouraged access to family planning. And it's one reason why these countries have, I think, a lot of people who want to leave and don't see much of a future for themselves in their own countries.
Because you're talking with me, we're going to shift from the doom
Sure.
and gloom. I know World Watch is really good at it.
No,
and I appreciate you sharing the
We're really good at
successes.
showing where the sunrises are.
I like the sunrises. You said something that astonished me. Not only am I not particularly used to hearing science and religion in the same conversation, I like it when it happens. You said, I wrote it down, we're going to be forced to learn to love one another.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the nature of reality. If you think about developing countries, you think, well, they don't emit many greenhouse gases, but they're growing so fast.
Per capita, they don't.
Per
but
capita,
they might use dirtier fuels on that kind of, as they go from burning solid fuels and having to go and gather forest wood. And it's really dangerous, actually, on the women and on the girls, and it affects them a lot.
Yeah.
Sorry, you.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. And the thing is that affects us. We cannot solve the climate issue by acting on our own. That's one of the reasons conservatives often say, don't even try. Why should you try? But the reality is we've got to solve the climate problem or we're going to fry. And in order for us to solve the climate problem, we have to recognize the dignity of every individual and the right of every individual to some certain amount, some per capita allotment of emissions or however we divide it, but it's got to be equitable or the developing countries are going to say, to heck with you guys, we're going to just keep on developing as fast as we can. We're not going to accept a second-class position in the world's economic development for centuries to come.
And that's one of the things that happens, I think, is stalling, like Copenhagen or the renewal of a climate agreement, is we haven't necessarily ironed out the developing countries taking the lead and funding some of that. Is that part of what you're talking about?
Yes, it's an equity issue.
And I'm thinking in I want to say Davos, the World Economic Forum, I think 94% 2 years ago agreed there's terrible economic inequity, and we don't know how to address it, and we don't know how to solve it. And it's clearly tied up in this overuse of resources that we're in the midst of right now. What are your thoughts on this? We have to learn to love each other and bring that up toward this problem.
Well, unfortunately, it came up late in the talk, and I didn't have the time to amplify it as I would have liked to.
How did you come to that, and how would you amplify it?
Well, essentially, if we can't deal with the equity issue, the problem of inequity, which is a problem in our own country in a big way, but it's a huge problem and a profoundly environmental problem in the world, we can't solve the world's problems.
I believe it's a problem. I believe it's hard. How can learning to love each other, how can that help with the smoke, the climate, that's getting rid of the health, the equity,
getting rid of this nationalism, this sense that Americans have to compete with the rest of the world. We need a more feminine view of how we relate to the rest of the world. It's much more about collaboration than it is about competition. We don't have to keep growing. America's got plenty. We could share it fairly with ourselves if we would just organize ourselves to do that. And we actually need to cut down on our consumption in a huge way. So we have to think about ways to find prosperity and well-being without using what you said, I don't know if the number is quite this high, but 80 times as many resources as somebody in a developing country. And if we don't do that, we're going to be increasingly seeing airliners shut down. We're going to be increasingly seeing people crossing our borders.
Okay, we're back to gloom and doom.
No, but I mean, but you've got to face the gloom and doom to deal with how do you get out of this. It's not going to go away on its own.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the heads of the military came out and said climate is a national security issue just a month ago.
Right.
Where have you seen this working? This loving one another, this bridging the equity? Where have you seen people saying, I got it, let's do something about it, where it's starting to show signs? I mean, when you talk about the relatingness, the feminine orientation, I think, a lot more reaching out, even among actually members of the, I don't mean to keep bringing up the armed services, but I see so much more of a service connectedness, seeking to understand orientation than I remember from when I was growing up, for example. I don't know, do you see parts of the world or parts of societies changing toward this learning
Yeah.
to love one another to bridge that equity? Do you
Yeah.
do you have one or two examples that you can share so I can get a better understanding of what that might look like, how
Yeah.
it might look?
Well, I guess the best immediate example I can give you as a picture is the kind of civil society actions you see at big conferences like the UN Rio Plus 20 conference in Rio de Janeiro in 2012, or the original one was in 1992 that I went to, where you see this incredible diversity of young people, similar to this meeting we're having today, of every color in the rainbow, and they know that they are not against or opposed to each other. They're against or opposed to the elders in their own countries who are blocking the kind of cooperative action that's needed to solve the world's problems. They're learning how to get along. They're learning how to love one another. I think you see this in the best of the world's religious communities, not necessarily at the hierarchical level, but at the level of the smaller communities. A lot of religions talk a lot about love. I'm not sure how well they are in actualizing it. But by love, I don't necessarily mean you've got to be going and hugging and kissing everybody, but you have to certainly recognize yourself and other people. You have to recognize the dignity of everybody you're dealing with. A lot of what terrorism is all about is that people feel they have no dignity, and they want to claim dignity. And if they have to claim dignity through violence, that's the only route that they see. But if their dignity had been acknowledged somehow from the time they were born, and this is a difficult issue, I don't have a pat answer for how we do this, but it starts with recognizing how important it is. I think to some degree the environmental community has been too focused on technology, changing laws, identifying bad guys like corporations, and saying, let's attack them, and not thinking enough about interpersonal relationships, intergender relationships, men and women learning how to love one another non-violently. Sexual violence is actually an environmental problem because sexual violence is such a problem in so much of the world. We can't come close to dealing with the overexploitation of natural resources in a lot of these places. These things are all really closely linked, and when I use this simple word, partly to shock environmentalists because they're not used to hearing it, of love, it's just a way of sort of a shorthand for we have to learn how to live together. It isn't necessarily hugging and kissing everybody you see, although it might not be a bad idea, it might feel okay. But it's about understanding everybody's dignity and feeling warm about other human beings. And it's something that I think needs to be cultivated. They say that if you smile, it actually brings on happiness. Don't wait till you're happy to smile, but you're smiling very nicely. You smile right now, and even if you're not feeling that great, suddenly it's like, that's a little better. And it's almost we need to exercise those muscles, even in the face of what you're calling the doom and gloom, for us to actually arrive at solutions. And we need those solutions really, really badly.
And it's in so many of the world's religions, it's the golden rule, it's the justice, it's the one doesn't have faith until one wants for another one what one wants for oneself, or can't be called a person of faith. It's in every religion in the world, this idea of holding oneself as one would hold oneself, or not doing unto someone else as one would not have done unto themselves. And it's the hardest thing to get to. I think it's why we need so many other rules. Yeah.
And I think, it's actually harder in a world like today where we're in more competition over scarcity of resources.
And I think I misspoke. It's not that hard to get to, really.
Well,
It's within us already.
I think it's there. I just think it is hard to get to, and the pull is in many ways more the other way, because as people are anxious about jobs, as they're anxious about access to water, access to food, access to energy, there's a sense of I'm going to have to get mine, and that's why I like to talk about this a lot. We, in spite of the world, probably, I don't want to make a prediction, but probably getting to be a harder place to live in over this coming century for all the environmental reasons that are going to be talked about this weekend. We have to go the opposite way that our instinct tells us to go, which is to circle wagons, protect what's mine. The less there is for everybody, the more I need to get. The more I give to you, the less I have for me. We have to find some way to go the opposite direction towards collaboration, cooperation, and particularly sharing, or we're just all going to die horrible deaths. There's your doom and gloom. But the alternative is to see what the opportunity and the challenge is by working in different ways and thinking in different ways. And my main point, and I haven't elaborated tremendously, but my main point is just that this is more in the social sphere, really, than it is in the environmental sphere, although we have to keep working in that sphere or we're cooked.
And it sounds like it's within ourselves, so it's something we can all work on throughout our lives, whatever our country or organization as well.
I think it's a personal exercise, it's a personal approach to life, whether you meditate or you pray or you just think deeply about these issues. I think it really is, within each of us to start moving on that.
Thank you so much. Robert Engleman, World Watch Institute.
Thank you.
Is there anything you'd like to point people to or let them know about what's coming up? Or how
No, I would just urge you to check out World Watch Institute's website. I have a book called More Population Nature and What Women Want, published by Island Press. I'll certainly mention that.
Please do, and thank you for being a man who's an advocate for women. I think that, I'm so proud that the Jewish community, as I learned about it, played a role in civil rights for African Americans. I hadn't known that. When I started discovering it, I was so proud. I felt so good about that, and I think you should feel so proud about being a man advocating for women.
Well, thank you very much.
Where one can and has voice.
Great. Thank you for the chat. It was very fun. Great. Thanks.